Hi, this is Dr. Carolyn Coker-Ross, bringing you the Inclusive Minds podcast. This podcast was inspired by the book of which I'm a co-editor, entitled Anti-Blackness and the Stories of Authentic Allies, Lived Experiences in the Fight Against Institutionalized Racism. If you're a psychologist, a social worker, an addiction professional, or a healthcare provider, or anyone who wants to broaden your horizons, then this podcast is for you. The goal of the podcast is to help you understand some of the more complex issues facing our culture today. My guests are experts in their fields, and we'll be talking about a wide array of topics, including cross-cultural issues, the intersection of race and trauma, social justice, and health inequities. They will be sharing both their lived experiences and their expert opinions. The goal is to give you a felt experience and to let you know that you're not alone in being confused by these complex issues. We want to provide nuanced information with context that will enable you to make your own decisions about these important topics. Hi, everybody. Dr. Carolyn Coker-Ross, and welcome to Inclusive Minds podcast. I'm here today with Dr. Kris Watson, and she is one of the authors in our book, Anti-Blackness and the Stories of Authentic Allies, Lived Experiences in the Fight Against Institutionalized Racism. And she has written a chapter that's really fascinating, so interesting. And the title itself is stunning. It's The Maniacal Imagination and Moral Ineptitude of the Church, the Construction and Sustainment of White Skin Supremacy. Let me tell you a little bit about Kris Watson. Reverend Kris Watson, Esquire, is a visionary leader and founder of Nurturing Justice Incorporated, a nonprofit focused on dismantling racial hierarchies through education and community building. She holds degrees from Vassar College, Fordham University School of Law, and a Master's of Divinity from New York Theological Seminar. With over 35 years of experience, she has served as an assistant district attorney in New York for several years and is a certified mediator and skilled facilitator. Wow, you've had a very interesting career. I love it. And I'm so jealous you went to Vassar. That's where I wanted to go to college. I hope you had a good experience there.
Well, it was an interesting experience, but thank you, Carolyn. I want to first say thank you so much for having me join this podcast. It's always a pleasure to see you and to talk about the work of dismantling the hierarchy of human value in the human family. It's my passion, it's my mission, it's my purpose. So I feel like I'm really in my purpose work, and I'm grateful to God for that because many people go through life and don't ever find their purpose.
It's so true. It causes a lot of misery when you can't
It's
be
true.
living from your purpose. If you don't mind, I know you've had quite a journey with the church. Sounds like you started out in the legal field and then became a minister or reverend,
Yes.
but there's a lot
There's
of
a lot.
story that
There's a lot
goes
of story.
from there to there. So
Yes.
if you can you tell us a little bit about your lived experience?
Thank you for asking. So I was born and raised in the Episcopalian church. My sister and I went to an Episcopalian private school in New York from junior kindergarten through 12th grade. We both graduated from there. And I loved the Episcopalian church for all of its pomp and circumstance and all of its pageantry and the incense and the costumes, the bishops and so forth. And then, when I went to college, I started exploring the Bible in different ways, but I got involved in activism in college. Anyway, long story short, very long story short, my journey led me into exploring various aspects of faith and spirituality, right? So I studied science of mind, I explored Buddhism, I just really was interested in anything that could enhance my spiritual development. So at a certain point in my life, I think it was back in 2006, a friend invited me to go to a Baptist church. with him. And my grandfather was a Baptist minister. So I'm like, well, I'd never been to the Baptist church per se. Like I'd never really, I'd been to maybe one or two services, but I'd never really, gotten into it. So I go to this Black Baptist church and, I go and I'm like, oh, praise the Lord, everybody, whatever. But the first time that the praise team came out, I started rocking and weeping and rocking and weeping.
Mm.
And I left the church and I'm like, I don't know what that was about, but it scared me. Right. So
Mm.
I said, I'm not going back there. I don't really.
Was it the intensity that scared you, or what was it?
Well, I mean, like, I just didn't really know what was happening, right? Like,
Mm.
maybe I just didn't know. I just felt like, I just couldn't stop crying. And I just was like, I don't know what this is
Mm.
about, right? So I left there and I said, well, I'm not going to go back there. But my friend called and said, can you come back a second time? So the second time I go, the same thing happens. The praise team comes out. I start rocking and weeping and rocking and weeping. And I'm like, okay, that's it. I'm not going back ever. One Sunday, I was awakened like sit straight up in the bed, like 4 o'clock in the morning, and with a voice saying, go back to that church. So I'm like, go back
Wow,
to the
that's
church.
amazing.
It was and so I get up, I get dressed, I go back to the church, and then the same thing happens. The praise team comes out and I start rocking and weeping, and I'm like, okay, I don't know. What is this? Then the preacher comes out and he starts preaching, and all of a sudden I'm on my feet and I'm shouting, you better preach, you better preach. And I'm like, who is doing that? Like, I'm an Episcopalian girl, right? I don't shout in church. And then the last thing I heard the preacher say, and people were on their feet, and it was a very spirited, as the Black Baptist Church can be, experience. And the last thing I heard the pastor say was, "We need the power of a living God." And then Carol and I went completely deaf. I couldn't
Mhm.
hear anything. I could see him up on the pulpit. He was still preaching. People were on their feet, but I couldn't hear anything.
Mm.
So the next thing I know, somebody had their hands on my shoulders and they were pushing me out of the aisle. The next thing I heard was the doors of the church are open and someone had their hands on my shoulders. They were pushing me out of my seat to the aisle and down the aisle to join the church.
Wow.
And so I ended up joining this church and, the next thing that happened is I'm standing in front of the entire congregation and they're saying, you know, "Thank you, God, for one more soul. Thank you, God, for one more soldier. Thank you, God, for one more warrior." And I'm saying, "What is going on?"
Mm.
So you know, when the pastor said, "Okay, you can go back to your seat now," I go back to my seat. I grab my purse. I go outside. It's freezing cold. And I stand in the cold and I'm like, "And what just happened?" And
Yeah.
then I realized I had joined this church. So from that day, that was a Sunday, all day Monday, and all day Tuesday, I could not stop crying.
Oh my goodness. What do you make of that looking back?
No, that was the spirit. That was definitely a
Yeah.
spirit on me.
Yeah.
So on Tuesday in the bulletin, it said they had Tuesday night teaching. So I go to back to the church on Tuesday night to find out what happened. What's
Yeah.
going on? So I figured, oh, it's Bible study. There'll be like 10 people, right? And it'll be boring. Well, there I go into the Bible study, there's 300 people. The pastor is there in jeans. He's, answering questions. And it was very informative. And then I raised my hand and I described the experience.
Mhm.
And I said, I came to your church. And he said, oh, stop, wait, it's not my church. And I said, okay, I came to the church. He said, that's better. And I said, and then I told him about what I just told you. And he said, yeah, I remember. He said, I saw you. You were sitting back there and I saw you, and he said, I saw it. He said, I saw the whole thing. He said, I saw when you came back. I saw the next time. And I said, but I can't stop crying. And I said, and you don't understand. I'm a professional woman and I cannot cry all day.
And
I
I'm an
can't.
Episcopalian. We
Right.
don't cry.
At that, right? At that, I'm an Episcopalian. I said, I cannot cry all day. And he said, well, I don't know what to tell you. He said, what I can say to you is that there have been people sitting in churches for the last 40 years hoping for a spiritual experience like you've had.
Yeah.
And he said, so I don't know. He said, I can tell you that you should strap yourself in. You're in for a journey. God is moving and we've got tissues. so so I said, "Well, okay." So I kept going back, and then about 3 months later, now it's interesting because the church was on Adam Clayton Powell Jr. Boulevard, and Adam Clayton Powell was one of my icons, idols, right? And in any event, I go back to the church one Saturday, I guess it was, and I was started talking to the pastor about Adam Clayton Powell and how much I admired him and like the whole connection with civil rights and human rights and so forth. And then the next day, and we were just chatting. And then the next day, Sunday, I go up to him and I said, Pastor, and he said, wait, he said, I dreamt about you last night. I woke up with you in my spirit this morning. God has given me a direction to say that you're going to be a deacon. And I said, a what? He said, a deacon. And I said, well, what is that? He just started laughing. And I said, "Well, is this something I have to pray about?" And he said, "No, it's not. It's nothing for you to pray about." He said, "This is a subtle command from the Lord. You will be a deacon." And I didn't know what it was. And then he said, "Just sit tight." And then when he announced it, everybody in the a lot of people in the congregation were pretty upset because I was new. But I went into a service as a walking deacon, which is a deacon in training. At that church, it was really the equivalent of the first year of seminary, right? The teaching, it was very intense. And, not just the teaching theologically and spiritual development, but also service, development of your gifts and talents for service to the community. I got ordained the next year as a deacon. That was in 2007, I believe. And then in 2009, I'm in church in a service. And then I felt the Spirit of the Lord sort of sit on my shoulder and just said, go to seminary. I'm calling you into ministry. And I'm like,
Come on.
the next day I go into my place of employment and they announced that they were actually going to be shutting down because they had lost a lot of money in the Bernie Madoff scandal. And God said, apply now. So I applied for seminary. And the day that I went for the interview at seminary was the first day of class in September.
Mm.
And so I go in and I meet with one of the deans, and he said, well, it's clear that you're called to ministry. And he just signed off on the application. And he said, class starts now. And I'm like, huh? He said, class starts like right now. So just take this to the bursar, make a $100 deposit, and go to class.
Mm.
So I did that. And then then my journey just continued. I continued serving as a deacon at the church that I was first called. And then I ended up doing supervised ministry in some other churches within the United Church of Christ. And then, a series of events. I was eventually ordained in the United Church of Christ. And then in 2018, I went into a training program to become a facilitator for a new program that they'd launched called Sacred Conversations to End Racism. It was really, it's really been a journey. It's been a lot of ups and downs with the denominational life. I've since left the United Church of Christ
But you
because
yourself had experiences of racism within the church,
oh,
right?
yes, incredible experiences of racism within the church. I was pastoring a congregation, and I can't mention its name, but churches who were looking for pastors, they create a profile, and
Mhm.
it tells the candidate, the ministers that are looking for pulpits, who they are and what they're looking for and so forth. And so the profile looked really, really, really enticing because it's like we're looking for a justice facing, community oriented, justice seeking, pastor who's going to help us to do this and, help us to be more in the world and seeking justice and so forth. And I'm like, well, that's me, right?
Yeah.
You all of my
Sounds
experience.
good.
That was great.
Yeah.
And it was a small, fairly small church, but it, was in a fairly affluent, community, and the people seemed very nice. And I profiled for the church, and they called me, and I was installed. And literally within maybe 3 weeks of being installed at a coffee hour, one of the women said to me, "Dear, can you make us collard greens and fried chicken one day, after service?"
Mm.
And I sort of looked at her and I'm like, I don't think you understand. I'm the pastor. And she's like, and then 2 weeks later, another woman said, you know, do you know you're expected to make us coffee every Sunday?
Mm.
And I said, hmm. So one of the deacons said to me that he always believed that people of African descent were inferior to people of European descent. So it's all just sort of,
And he said that right to your face. It's kind of shocking for someone to.
yeah. I mean, to be fair, it could have been in the context of he's not trying to say I'm inferior, but that's how he was raised, right? To
Yes.
always believe that people of African descent were inferior to people of European descent.
Yeah. And in your chapter, you actually talk about how that's really part of the origin story of the church itself.
Oh, it is. I mean, well, and one of the things that happened to me in the church is, when I started training as a facilitator in sacred conversations to end racism, learning for the first time that the church was the architect of white skin supremacy and white supremacist ideology. It was mind boggling.
Can
It
you
was
say a little bit more about that for people who haven't
Well, in the
understand it?
I mean, in the chapter of the book, my co-author Claire Toomey, documents the history of the papal bulls and how essentially the church ordered people to go into foreign lands, Africa, and into native lands and into South America, and to basically vanquish and rule supreme over people who were indigenous to those lands. And they're all, pagans, they're this, they're that, and obviously all for profit. It's all racialized capitalism, all for profit. And rape the land and don't worry about the people. They're animals, they're this, they're that, right? So, and they're not even really people, they're just beasts, right? So you can do whatever you want with them. And so learning this, just started really, you know, shifting my whole attitude and then seeing how the church, and of course, then connecting all the dots and seeing how the church over the centuries has been, has erected its foundation on those very principles. And in becoming an institution, really became the empire that the ministry and the teachings of Jesus sought to, destroy.
Yeah.
And so the church for centuries has just been an institution that is built on perpetuating itself and subjugating people of color and others. And it's antithetical. The institution of the church, in many ways, in my opinion, is antithetical to the gospel of Jesus that is taught that I know about, right? And this brown skinned Palestinian Jew who came to set the oppressed free, who declare his manifesto to be, I am here, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. The church is not preaching good news to the poor. The church is actually continuing to subjugate and oppress the poor and build up its own coffers and its own self. And, when you look at the wealth of the Catholic Church, you look at the wealth of the Episcopalian Church, although it's fading now, you look at, white Christian nationalism, you look at all of these things and you're like, this is all about money. It's all about power. It's all about white skinned people trying to maintain dominance. Even the New Apostolic movement, it's the same thing, right? So it's really all about let's make America white and rich again, right? And let's get rid of everybody who's not. And so, it's very,
A lot of people will push back on that. If they're hearing this, they may be saying, well, that's not my church. My church is different. And we are set up to, we don't believe in white supremacy. And think about the black churches that you talk about in your chapter. The black church itself has some complicity in this.
without a doubt.
For people who don't understand this or haven't been educated about it, or who a lot of people don't wanna believe that the church is part of the white supremacist movement, right?
Right. Well, the thing about it is that in nurturing justice, we basically teach is racism and white skin supremacy ideology is actually the air that we breathe. There's no one that can escape it. I don't care what the color of your skin is. It's not escapable because it's built into the fabric of our nation and in fact the world. And in the black church, in many black churches, and then particularly, I would say particularly in the South, in many black churches, you'll go into the church and you'll see pictures of white Jesus, blonde hair, blue eyed or brown haired, blue eyed Jesus, who's just this sweet smelling savior. And won't he do it? And all of these niceties about Jesus. But Jesus was a radical brown skinned Palestinian Jew who came, against the forces of empire that made people feel that they were not fully human and that oppressed them. And you cannot, even in the black church, then, you've got this notion of a Jesus that is that you're supposed to be codependent on. And Jesus came to teach us that we had the divine power. When Jesus said in his teachings, these things that I do, you can do also, and even greater things than these shall you do. I mean, the thing about it is that the empire is designed to make you codependent or dependent on a structure and a system and institutions that are actually oppressive. And in the Black church, you have all kinds of issues, right? You have misogyny, you have, I mean, the patriarchy is off the chain. And while women have made some advances, the truth of the matter is, if you look at when you go to look at and register for like conferences and major conferences where Black preaching is done, most of the preachers are men. Like they're the only ones that have the gospel to deliver. And there's a lot of in the hierarchy is set up to cater to the egos of fragile people who really just want the power and control over the people.
I wanna just bring in the notion of sin because my younger brother just passed away from the complications of alcohol use disorder
Mhm.
after, a long period, and, we had a funeral in my home state of Texas, and it was held at the church that he and my younger sister belonged to, and the minister kept saying over and over, "George is not perfect. George is not perfect. He's a sinner. He's a sinner." But we love him, and all of that. And when it came time for me to speak, I was moved to say, my brother is perfect. He's perfect in the eyes of
Exactly.
God because he came here to learn whatever he had to learn. I don't know his innermost feelings or whatever his desires of his soul were. But, in my eyes, he was a perfect human being.
That's right. That's
Mhm.
right. You're absolutely right. And this thing about sin, to me, that whole thing about sin is really just that's another control mechanism that's used by the church. The deal is that sin is anything that makes you believe that you're separate from God, right?
Exactly.
Anything that separates you or that instills in you the notion that there is some difference between you and God, right? We come here as perfect beings, and George had a disease, right? I mean, it
He
was
had
no
a
different.
disease. The other thing that the church rails against is he was also gay, and
Well,
that's the other reason he wasn't, quote, unquote, "perfect," that's
that
a real
whole that
problem in the church.
right, that whole notion, the anti-LGBTQ and trans, that whole thing is, there is nothing in the Bible. Okay, there's really, I mean, unless you're going to quote like Leviticus or, but people cherry pick the Bible, right?
Yeah.
And the truth of the matter is that people think that the Bible was actually like written by God. Or written by Jesus. Like no one was walking behind Jesus with a pad and pen taking down notes
Or a recording device.
or recording device, right? And and they call I mean, I believe that the Bible is the inspired word of God, but I don't believe in the inerrancy of the Bible. I just don't believe that. These books were written by human beings to certain communities. And basically what was being said to Israel was distinguish yourself from the other communities around you. Okay? And don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. And by that you will distinguish yourself from the other communities around you. So this whole notion that God makes, that people's sexual orientation makes them sinful is absolutely absurd in my opinion. And there's nothing in the Bible, there's nothing definitely in the New Testament in Jesus' teachings that indicate such. And when you see, for example, the prophet Jeremiah was rescued by an Ethiopian eunuch. And I read that and I thought, this is really interesting. I said, basically, the prophets, the one that even that Jesus modeled himself after, right? Jeremiah was rescued, by from the empire and the forces of the empire by an Ethiopian eunuch who basically the black queer people are going to be rescuing everybody, right? Are going to be rescuing the prophets because that's the deal. Like, I mean, there's no shame in anything about people's human identity. There's, people are, this is why we have to rid ourselves of the notion that there's a hierarchy of human value based on any kind of difference, skin color, sexual orientation, ability, differently abled, anything. We have to stop this because it's so corrosive to the notion of how God wants us to live, which is in good relationship with love and kindness and to have joy in the world.
It's going in the opposite direction, right?
We are going in the
Hey,
opposite.
We're seeing a collision between politics and I just saw a picture of the new head of the White House Faith Department or whatever. So now there's a White House Faith Department in the United States of America where there's supposed to be separation of church and state. And politics has been, deeply embedded into religion in America. And now white supremacy is a blatant part of that.
Right. I mean, and it's always been. It's just that it's been hidden in different ways. But this movement that's going on now has been in brewing for decades and decades. This is nothing new. And now it's just been given license. And I think that, those of us of faith, those of us who have courage really just have to be very observant and be very careful about what we ingest in media. And because part of this whole thing that's happening is it designed to make us very fearful. And fear is, as Howard Thurman says, one of the hound dogs of hell. If they can scare you enough, they can scare you into hiding in a corner and cowering and not speaking your voice and not speaking up. And they make you fearful of one another, right? So that you don't engage in relationship. And God desires nothing more, in my opinion, than for us to be in right relationship with one another,
Yeah.
which is one of the reasons why I started nurturing justice is because, I started doing these groups and we call them relational transformation because in this country, particularly, we really are much more segregated than we think. And
Mhm.
people just don't have an experience of one another. We don't experience each other's lives. We don't get to have conversations with one another about how we feel about things. Oh,
Pandemic made that worse. Now we can
completely.
stay at home to get groceries. We can stay at home,
Absolutely.
all our meals. You know,
Exactly.
they can deliver our medications here.
Exactly.
I find
Like,
myself really isolated after
I know, very
a lot of
isolated.
reasons.
Oh, absolutely. Then that's fear. It's all, but I mean, it was practical in the pandemic times, and it's still practical in many ways because people don't, you now have unlearned how to be in relationship with one another, right? And how to have, interactions that are pleasant and that are fruitful and that are informative. And the other part of it is that we haven't been taught, the intentional erasure of the true history of this country is really very, significant because we don't know each other's history. We don't know our own history. People of European descent do not know their history. Nell Painter has a great book, The History of White People. It's very important to read it because when white people start to learn their own history, they see how depraved it really is. So, and none of this is done, the work I do is not done to shame or to blame anyone. It's just to enlighten, to educate, to be in conversation. And first you have to dismantle that hierarchy of human value notion within yourself before you can go out there and start looking at all the ways in which it manifests itself in the systems that we live amongst, live in and live by.
I think you're right that fear is, you know, the pervading sentiment
Yes,
in
without a doubt.
in the United States. And a lot of it is, very valid because we're seeing things happen that we aren't used to really accepting or even thinking that they could happen. People being detained at the border who have legitimate reasons.
US citizens.
US
US citizens,
citizen. It's not
and
even
to be deported to countries they've never visited before. When Trump started talking about we're gonna deport people to, Turks and Caicos, I'm like,
yeah.
"Get up on that list."
But
Sign me
map
up.
to jails in Guatemala or
Right, right,
Guantanamo Bay now,
right.
so
Oh, it's outrageous. It's outrageous. And the thing about it is that I'm prayerful. One of the things that I had to do after November 6th, I turned off the news altogether because none of it, I just feel that all of it is tainted. When no matter how progressive or how conservative it is, it's all tainted. And it kept me in a constant state of anxiety and fear. And I'm like, I cannot, there's one thing I can control is my environment. I can
that's
control.
true, and I guess my concern about that is, I've read a lot about what happened before World War II. One of the things that happened is people weren't aware of what was happening. They didn't make themselves aware. They weren't staying in touch. They kind of unplugged and said, "This doesn't." this doesn't apply to me. Like all the people
Right.
and even people who have immigrated to our country who are saying, "Oh, well, I'm not gonna get deported.
Right. Right. Exactly. And
My
look.
grandmother won't get deported.
Right.
He doesn't have papers because
Right.
I voted for a
Because
certain person."
I voted for right. Well, the thing about it is that, the thing is because you can never be fully detached from what's happening, right? You can never be fully detached because you get it whether it's in your social media feed, you get it whether it's through the podcasts that you listen to or the subscriptions that you have, and you get it through, as soon as you turn on your computer, here you have like, all these boxes, all these news stories.
Yeah,
And so
that's for you and for me for sure, but I have a lot of patients who have really disconnected, don't know what's happening
right.
because they are so fearful, and they also feel that none of this it matters to them, and so I read, Heather Cox Richardson's
Right.
newsletter
Right.
every day, and she gives, what's happening in the news, but with historical context. So
Right.
that's not as upsetting to me, and I can do that, and then I can stay informed. But,
Exactly.
I'm talking to patients every day who are, upset, worried, and yet uninformed, or
Right.
informed by different news. So I don't want to go down the rabbit hole with that.
I know that is a rabbit hole.
It is a rabbit hole.
It
But let
is.
me let me ask you this. So, with your journey in the church, what do you think are the challenges in actually dismantling racism and confronting this legacy of white skin supremacy in the Christian church?
I don't know that racism can be dismantled. It is so thoroughly baked into the framework and the fabric of our nation, and therefore in us. I think that the church has to be really intentional about teaching the true history. I'm encouraged by churches, for example, churches in Florida that push back against some of that anti CRT, right, which is a ridiculous culture,
Anti-critical race theory.
critical race theory. But and started teaching their children. The black church started teaching their children about the true history of their people
That's amazing.
and unusual. And I think that that really has to be done. I'm hopeful for churches that are undertaking to, have bad book clubs and buy bad books for their kids and, and try to attract kids to be involved in learning about their true history and youth groups and so forth. But I think that from an institutional standpoint, the church is going to fall under its own weight eventually, in my opinion. You can't, because I don't believe that. I mean, I believe that financially, many churches will still survive because they're too wealthy
Yes.
to not survive. But I believe that, they'll be just what they are, hollowed out buildings of, that are teaching doctrine, and I think that God is gonna deal with that. I just do. I just trust that that's gonna be dealt with. I think that the hope is gonna come in pockets, that the hope for a changed institution will come in pockets. One of the things that I did with Nurturing Justice is I started a spiritual community, for the people that are in my circle. I'm called the Transformational Remnant. I believe that we have to have a remnant of us who are, you know, believers or who have faith of any sort, right? It doesn't even have to be Christian, that can really go to the deeper spiritual concepts and hold space for one another and look at different, looking at Christianity, looking at Buddhism, looking at Islam, looking at Sufism, looking at all of these different faith traditions that have something beautiful to offer that gives us solace. Looking at poetry, and because the gospel is still being written, right? Poetry and music and art, all of these are sacred texts, in my opinion. And so we come together monthly for like 90 minutes and just, have like what we call the village square, and we have meditation and we have prayer, and we, share our anxieties and our concerns and our worries, but also our joys and build a
I think
community.
a lot of people would want something like that. I no longer go to church because I don't like being preached at, and then
Right.
like you, my experience with my brother's funeral and having a black
Yes.
male preacher telling me my brother's not perfect. I don't like that. I have my
Right.
own beliefs
Exactly.
that have been hard earned as yours have, going to different churches, teaching
Right.
myself about them, reading about them, learning from other people, and so on. But I think a lot of people are looking for solace,
Yes,
peace,
they are.
and connection. But what I'm finding in the church is while there may be some community there, I'm not finding peace or solace.
No, you're not. Well, the Transformational Remnant meets on the second Thursday over Zoom, the second Thursday of every month, and we just hold space for 90 minutes. So I will make sure that you have the Zoom link for
And
that.
yeah, I can put it in the show notes for people.
Absolutely,
Mm,
absolutely. I will send it to you because it's really a beautiful space and it so much is revealed. And the more people we get, the bigger the container, the better the energy, the bigger the energy will be. Right.
yeah.
So I believe
Well,
that,
I wanna talk a little bit more about nurturing justice, though. Can you tell me a little bit more about the work?
sure. So I started nurturing justice back in 2021 after spending all of 2020 and almost all of 2021 basically sitting behind a Zoom screen, working with different groups around the country from the West to the South to the East Coast, doing sacred conversations to end racism groups. We do 2-day workshops. We do 5-month deep dives, 3-month deep dives into books about, teaching basically looking at the history of race and racism in America and how it developed. At a certain point, we started out with this notion that we wanted to dismantle racism. And then I'm like, okay, this is a pretty much impossible thing. And I wanted to expand it because I wanted just like this is when I started looking at all the intersectional justice issues. So this is really about dismantling the hierarchy of human value based on difference. And this was, a term that was coined by Gail Christopher, who's a prominent racial justice person. What we did was we started this community and we, basically we asked people to come into community with groups of 15 to 20 people and commit to spending 5 to 6 months, anywhere from 3 to 6 months, doing a deep dive, building relationship, and studying together and looking at all the various justice issues and how we can, like, uproot the hierarchy of human value notions that we have within ourselves. And then to take that information and to find a project, to find a whatever you're passionate about, whether it's queer justice or environmental justice or reproductive justice or racial justice. Get involved in some way in your community on the local and state level, and we're now incorporating community organizing training. So the other thing we do is we have educational events, right? So we host authors and prominent or not so prominent people in the community that are just doing the work that have written books or not written books that just to talk about various things. So we had, for example, Aubrey Hendricks, who's done a lot of work and written a lot about white Christian nationalism and Christians against Christianity. We had Rob Eshman, who wrote a book about racism and resistance in the digital age, and they're all up on our YouTube channel. We talked about jazz and justice, racism in the music industry and the jazz music industry specifically, racism in the criminal justice system, where I started at, my career as a prosecutor and then as a defense attorney. We had a prominent attorney who's also a board member who is one of the most successful death penalty attorneys in the country. And, we try to educate, we try to inspire, we try to bring people together to build relationship, and then we try to send people out into the community to do some work, some to make a difference in their communities. And then, of course, now we're doing the spiritual component of the transformational remnant, which is my heart, heart, heart.
Nice. I love that. I love the name too, the dress.
Yeah, I love the name too. Well,
So
I don't want to take credit for the name. We were in a panel discussion with Michael Emerson and Glenn Bracey, who wrote a book called The Religion of Whiteness. And Glenn Bracey was talking about, we need a transformational remnant. And my co-facilitator and I looked at each other and said, that's it. That's the name of our spiritual community. And so I give him credit because he's brilliant and, beautiful and has written an amazing book with Michael Emerson called The Religion of Whiteness.
awesome. So, what most disturbs you, though, about what's happening in our world today?
Well, I think we talked about it, the fact that people are being scared to death.
So
The people are
that's the thing that's at the core that disturbs.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, and, the racism doesn't surprise me. The misogyny doesn't surprise none of it surprises me, right? Because we saw it coming. We know it's been building. What's really, what I think that what's is most disturbing is the fact that people are being scared out of their minds And as a result of the fear, they are losing. I mean, if you notice, people are not as sharp mentally as they once were. It's almost like this cloud that has descended on our country and on the world is tainting our ability to be fully human and to be connected to our source, which is pure energy and love and light.
That's what stress does on a physiological
Exactly,
level. Yeah.
exactly. It's
So
on a
hurt your
physiological
brain
level. It's
works. Yeah.
exactly. It's on an energetic level. It's on a spirit. It's everything, and it's shrinking us
Yeah. It's
into these like
constricted.
completely constricting.
Yeah.
And I think that, that's what's most disturbing about it. And that's what we have to really fight against. We have to find spaces and places and people that will help us expand our consciousness, expand our ability to be fully who we are. And we have to find those spaces, right?
Mm.
And I hope to create that, I hope that I'm creating that in nurturing justice where people can just be who they are and talk honestly without shame or guilt or blame and without, and to transcend anger, right? Because
Yes, I think besides fear, anger is
anger is it. Anger, yes.
it.
And so, the prophets really, all the major prophets really transcended anger at the situation that they were prophesying against and moved to love.
Hmm,
So, how do we move to love? How do we
that's the
move?
question
Right.
for you.
How do Yeah, it is. I mean, well, look, how do we move to love? I think that we have to look at one another and say, you are perfect in God's sight. I
Mm,
want to try to look at you through the eyes of God. I want to suspend judgmentalism, right? Which is like the lowest vibrational frequency you can be on, next to death. I mean, it's like, judging other people to within an inch of our lives. Like we really need to look at each other and give some grace, give some kindness. Look at the person and say, "This is a child of God. This is a child who's got a person who's got the same energy, the same source." There's only one thing, Carolyn, right? There's only one thing. And we're all part of that one thing, whether we recognize it or not. And so how am I going to look at you, which is part of that one thing, and say, "Well, I'm a better part of that one thing. I'm better than, it's
mm.
it's absurd."
I
So
think some of the anger also comes from, like, the divisiveness that we're experiencing, because
right.
even though, we in the past, we've had different opinions about things, but we haven't felt like, "Oh, I can't talk to this person." And it's
Right.
interesting now because that feels like you can't talk about a certain subject. I've been in groups where the subject of politics or what's happening come up, and then boom, everybody splits to different sides. And I think that's really difficult.
It's interesting because I've asked see, everybody can be divisive until an issue impacts them.
Mhm.
So, "Oh, I love this person. I love this ideology. I love this politic, this party, this whatever." Until something is done to impact your ability to eat, to live, to move, to breathe, to have freedom, right? And and then it's like, "Oh, I've been duped. I've been run amok, led astray. How did this happen? I've been bamboozled."
Yeah.
And then people start to wake up, right? So the thing is, I mean, I've had conversations, for example, on the reproductive justice issue. I've had conversations with people who said, "I just can't get with that abortion thing. I can't." And I'm like, "Okay, well, let me ask you this. Forget about abortion for a minute, because it's not that's language that we don't really need to use. How do you feel about a woman's right to have make decisions over her own body?" "Oh, no, I'm in favor of that." Okay. So full stop. Period. Full stop.
Yeah.
Let's just stop there. It's the way that it's language, it's the way things have been framed. And it's also looking at people and like, what is that one question that you could ask somebody that you disagree with that might open their mind to see another possibility? And how can what's the one question that they could ask of you
Mhm.
that would open your mind? Because it's never an either or, it's always a both and, right?
Yeah.
And how do we get to that place where we can understand the both and? Like we have to stop talking in such absolutes, and we have to recognize that people's opinions are people's opinions, and they're in their minds they're equally valid. And you might
Yeah.
disagree with it, But what's the one question that you could ask yourself or that you could ask another that will open your mind to see things from a different perspective? And that's the conversation I want to have, right? I mean, I don't want to shut anybody out. Of course, I have to then manage my anger, right?
Yeah, that's
Then
right.
that stuff in the pit of my stomach that makes me want to be like, "These person's an idiot." But,
Tell me as we close, what gives you hope now?
I think that what gives me hope is just my ability to see, and the prayer that other people will see the beauty of God's creation and who we all are. And I just hope, I think that one of the things that's happening with what's going on in the world is that it's elevating people spiritually. People are seeing, okay, I need to disconnect from this material world and I need to connect higher, connect in deeper and more intense and meaningful ways with the spirit world.
I
And
think
this,
a lot of us are feeling that because I started meditating again,
yes.
which I haven't
And that's
done in decades,
right.
but I
Right.
felt
And
that.
that's hopeful. You'd have
Yeah,
to.
yeah.
'Cause how else will you maintain your peace and your equilibrium? Come to the transformational remnant and
Well,
be with us.
I will definitely come, I promise you
Yeah.
that, but I wanna also open it up to other people, so we will put a
Absolutely.
link to it in the show notes and also a link to Nurturing Justice for people who are interested in your transformational work, which is
Thank you.
amazing.
I would love to. I would love to invite all of your listeners and your people, your community to join us. I mean, it's a three, on the West Coast, it's a time difference, but we can make things work, right? I mean, people make things work that they want to participate in.
Yeah, and I think with this podcast, the reason I call it Inclusive Minds is I think people are so yearning for a connection to
Yes.
something that's real and something that gives them hope. I don't have to constantly be worrying and fearful and what's next tomorrow? What's gonna happen then? It's just
We invite people just to come into the space and just be, you don't even have to participate. You can just observe if you want, right? So, and it's no pressure.
well, it's
And
been great
that's what you
talking
want.
to you today, Chris. I really
I
have
love
enjoyed
you.
our
God bless
conversation.
you. Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for the opportunity to write a chapter in the book that you edited. It was amazing. The book was amazing. It is amazing. And I'm
And your
really
chapter is really, really, really unusual. People who read your chapter will learn a lot, and I think will
I
give
hope
us
so.
different perspective about the subjects we've been talking about today. So
Thank you so much, Carolyn. God bless you.
God bless you too. Thanks for listening. Please subscribe to the Inclusive Minds podcast so we can let you know when the next great guest comes on. The link to subscribe is in the caption below.